Alrighty, hello. Welcome to Operator Served Up 3 Ways, making subtractive, additive, and FM synth patches from scratch. So this is my AEMCon Virtual Summit video, and well, I wish we could be doing this in person, but this is the next best thing. And as you can see, I'm coming to you from my basement here. So I'm a little new to creating these types of videos, so bear with me, but something I'm definitely not so new to is Operator. Operator's been kind of a main staple synth of mine for a while. This video is going to talk about creating sounds from the ground up, from scratch, approaching them from kind of those three synthesis methods, from subtractive, additive, and FM approaches. Of course, that's really the best selling point of Operator, the fact that it combines the best of these three worlds. That's not to say we're going to draw strict lines between these methods, like this is only an additive sound or this is only an FM sound. In fact, really, these are going to kind of incorporate all three at once in most cases. So we're just going to talk about kind of what makes them different, and hopefully really this will generate some ideas and some inspiration for creating your own patches. The live set that I'm using is going to be available to you as a live pack, so you'll be able to download it and follow along. Please feel free to use any of this in your own production, any of these sounds or loops or whatever. That's why it's here. My hope is that you'll take these and run with them and make them even better. The one sort of thing you have to keep in mind is that you'll need both Ableton Live 10 to open this, and also you'll need the Max for Live and more importantly the Max for Live Essentials installed. There's a couple of key components here, like the convolution reverb, especially over in the drums. There's a lot of make use of the instant house in there, and a couple other little Max for Live devices, some of the envelope and LFO and such. So if you don't have those installed, then this will probably not work for you, or it'll tell you you're missing a bunch of plugins. But yeah, having said that, let me just play these three kind of sections of this little idea. You can't really call it a full song yet, but I'll play the three little parts, and then we'll start going through the sounds and picking them apart, starting with the future pad, which is going to be our kind of subtractive synth sound, and I'll worry about the drums and the other auxiliary sounds and stuff at the end. So you get the idea. It's pretty straightforward. Now, as I said, we'll start with the future pad sound. All of these synth sounds were created with Operator, or which more often than not turned into multiple operators stacked together in an instrument rack. Of course, all these presets and stuff will be part of this. You can tweak them and pick them apart and do some different things with them. So let's quickly take a look at some kind of bullet points about subtractive synthesis. When I think subtractive synthesis, I think starting with harmonically powerful stuff like sawtooth and square. There's a reason why most of the classic analog synths, like pick just about any of those ones behind me. Well, maybe except the CZ one in the middle there. Mostly you'll see the same wave shapes show up, square and sawtooth, and generally things that are very bright sounding on their own. You don't see a lot of old analog synths that have like sine waves as their starting point, and there might be a couple of reasons for that. Like it's maybe harder to produce a perfect sine wave, but I think more likely is just that there isn't really much to subtract from a sine wave. It's harmonically supposed to be at least a very pure kind of sound, and when you first open up an operator, that's exactly what you get, is just pure sine wave. There we go. So we get this, and again, that's another reason why I really like operator, because sometimes we want that. Sometimes we want just a pure sine wave. If we're making certain sounds, sine waves are good for little plinky things. We can take the envelope and make it short and spiky like that. Maybe not quite that short, and give it a little bit of a release tail there, and throw it through a bunch of effects and reverb and delay. That type of sound definitely has its place too, and as far as the actual synthesis elements are concerned, it's about as basic as it could possibly get, with just a sine wave going through a volume envelope, and the filter's really not entering into it at all. In fact, we could bypass the filter there and still be left with essentially the same sound. So the point is that subtractive synthesis more often than not starts with very harmonically rich material, because there's more to shave off, there's more to get rid of, more harmonic content to alter. Hopefully that makes sense. Of course, the things that are doing the subtracting, the filters, and the envelopes controlling the VCAs and things, these are really vital to the character of the sound, as are which waveforms you start with and how you mix them together. Mixing not just a bunch of variations of the same waveform together, but saw and square or whatever it happens to be. So there's a lot of variation to be had, even just with the basic waveforms that we're used to. And of course, again, I'm a big fan of classic vintage synths, so certainly for me, there's a nostalgia element. Also, I just like the subtle tweaking aspect of subtractive synths. There's these sort of universal concepts that you can apply to all of our different subtractive synthesizers, like envelope control and LFO control, but they're all implemented in different ways. And some very basic synths, some hardware synths, might only give you one LFO, or they might only give you a basic amp envelope and filter envelope. That's it. Whereas some others will give you lots more option. They'll give you auxiliary envelopes, pitch envelopes, LFOs that you can use to modulate other LFOs. That the more of that kind of subtle variation you can bring into it, the better, because software instruments and digital instruments in general tend to lack some of the unintentional subtlety that old instruments have. And if you look at some of the stuff like the Mini Moog behind me there, that really still has its classic reputation, partially because of how overdriven the filter is, and how that stage of the sound shaping is actually just as responsible for the character as the sound that comes out of the oscillators. And actually on the Mini Moog, there's no real way short of modifying it to turn the filters right off to take them out of circuit. So again, we have to make up for all of this inherent weirdness and inherent kind of flaw in the sounds by introducing them ourselves. So let's take a quick look at our first future pad here. Now, these future pads are pretty prevalent in trap music and a lot of kind of bass genres and such. It's funny, a lot of pad sounds tend to have a lot slower attack times, kind of more in line with like what a string section would do. But this future pad sound is, it's got more attack for sure. But it does have that, airy sort of high pass quality that you can hear all that white noise kind of fluttering around in the background. Future pads are all about motion and sweep and animation. And of course, there's many ways to achieve that, depending on what synth you're using. If it's Wavetable, you might be relying heavily on the Wavetable sweep functions and sweeping through different wavetables. And that's great too. That results in some very nice future pads in its own right. But you can get a lot of nice sweep and air even just by incorporating some white noise, which is what this bottom noise layer is for. Also some noise modulation. So we have our LFO on what we're calling our noise layer, and that's also set to the noise waveform. If we click on our LFO, it's going to, for oscillators, although honestly, oscillator B is set to white noise, so it wouldn't actually matter if this was turned on or not. Really, oscillator A is the only one that matters. So if we solo that noise layer by itself, we get this weird sputtery kind of thing on it. So the first layer is called the saw layer, and not surprisingly, it's all made up of saw Ds, which I have tuned in different octaves. So I've got one at 1, one at 2, 3, and 4. You can see I went in kind of a funny order there, but the 3 one you can see is mixed a lot quieter than the other 3, or the other oscillators, I mean. And that's on purpose. If this was turned up more, it creates a perfect fifth. It creates kind of a chord, which isn't really what I want. I wanted it to just be kind of adding to the tone a little bit, adding to the harmonics. So that's why that one stays a little bit quieter than the others. But yeah, these are all tuned to saw D. And you can see I've got a little bit of spread dialed in there. I've got it set at about like 50%, 51%. And you may have also noticed that the filter is completely switched off. It's bypassed. So really we're kind of hearing the straight sound of the oscillators coming right out of this. But I also have a lot of post filtering going on. So all 3 of these layers, these operator layers in my instrument rack, they all have their filters bypassed, with the idea being that these 2 filters on the end of these whole chains are going to kind of unify the sound and make it all sound like it's coming from the same synth, if that makes sense. So that's the saw layer. And then we've got the square layer, which is sort of a similar idea, but using square waves. Again, they're kind of complementary sounds. I like that sort of hollow square sound, but I also like that really buzzy, bright sawtooth sound. And you can see that I've panned them a little bit to each side to hopefully make the stereo field a little more broad, a little more interesting. Put those back on. So it's getting a little bit thicker sounding now, just with those 2 layers engaged. And then the noise layer, of course, we've got all that noise modulation from the LFO affecting oscillator A's pitch. Here's the difference. Here's without that noise modulation. It's not bad, but when we turn that on, makes it a little more interesting, a little less stagnant, I guess you could say. So again, we've got the auto filters at the end of this chain. We have a static HP, or static high pass filter. So it's not making a huge difference, but it's just high passing all of it. And then we've got the pump filter here, which is being sidechained or being controlled by the kick drum track. So that's where our kind of pumping is coming from. So of course this isn't going to be doing anything when the transport's not running, but there we go. That's pretty much what's going on in this feature pad layer here. The second feature pad track, I basically copied this whole instrument rack over and kind of changed it around a little bit. Got rid of the static high pass filter and added a different auto filter. This time I've put a couple of LFO midis in an envelope, a MIDI envelope in front of it. So these three things, these two things are also Max for Live devices. They're very handy if you want, either an LFO or an envelope where there isn't one, or if you just want one with different features, because auto filter does have its own LFO built in. It's just not a very elaborate one. So there's all kinds of things I like about the LFO MIDI, like the jitter and smooth control and the phase and offset controls. It's just a very complete and useful LFO for lots of things. You can see I've got this one mapped to frequency, to filter frequency, which would be this one over here. And then I've got this LFO mapped to this LFO's depth control. So we got kind of an LFO controlling an LFO. And then I've got this envelope controlling this LFO's offset. So you can see how this line's kind of down at the 0 point, and then as this comes up, this curve should rise and start to oscillate some more. So point here being that you can get some really cool modulation shapes just by combining LFOs and envelopes in interesting ways. It becomes a lot less predictable than just using a single LFO to modulate something up and down. That can become very predictable over time. You can see that this one is in sync mode, so you can see the offset control moving up, but you don't see the LFO actually running and producing oscillations. And this one's actually running, but it's producing a sine wave that's really, really slow and fairly short as well, so it doesn't really look like it. When I start the transport, though, I'll solo this. There we go. So it's actually really cool. You can see auto filter. You can see the cutoff moving as it's doing that. So there are some situations, especially when you're making big stacky sounds like this in instrument racks, where it sort of brings everything back together in a nice way. It sort of glues everything together in a nice way if you use auto filter at the end of the chain, sort of like a paraphonic setup. How some old school synths might have 8 oscillators, but because it was cheap, like the Korg Poly 800 is a good example. It only has one filter instead of one filter per voice, like the OB8 behind me has, the one at the top there. So that's the feature pad sound. Again, there's a lot you can change and vary up about that. Just to give you some context, I was kind of inspired by some artists like Flume and sort of some of the pad sounds that they use. This one in this Flume tune is a little quite a bit more sawtoothy and a little bit less noisy and fluttery than mine is, but sort of in that same spirit.
Taking your time, work my mind, and I'll play with you. And play pretend it's all true. Follow me down, listen around to that deep dark sound.
So you could hear like more towards the end there how it the filter kind of opened up, and that was like strategic in with like what the song was doing and how it was about to like hit into the chorus and stuff. So that's what I mean about future pads being, you know, very much about the movement and what the filter cutoff is doing and such. You know, if we get rid of the LFO stuff on here. So, you know, we could definitely do something a little bit more like the Flume track. But, of course, for that kind of thing, I would maybe turn the attack times way down if you wanted to get that kind of more of that fade in sort of vibe. But anyways, the point being that putting auto filters at the end of your chains and just ganging up a bunch of operators like that really gets you in some nice pad territory. Adding lots of modulation to the mix really helps animate things and make those layers, you know, nice and interesting. Some quick tips for operator subtractive sounds when we're starting from that subtractive mindset. The brighter sounding waveforms like saw D, square D, they're definitely more noticeable when using the filter. So, you know, if you're using sine waves or, you know, the lower resolutions of sawtooth waves, the filter's action isn't going to be as drastic. Hence your, you know, sweeps and stuff aren't going to be as drastic. And of course, introducing error into the sound, like detuning, using the noise waveform to modulate the oscillator pitch and filter cutoff, kind of like I had going in that sound, or even just adding white noise as a layer to get that sort of wash in the back. That really helps make the high frequencies stand out a lot more. Using the spread control and stacking multiple operators, of course, that really helps. And it's very easy to do, just to keep grouping them together. And, you know, if you run out of oscillators, then stack some more on there, stack another operator or two in there. And, of course, all the animation, the modulation, whether that's done manually by drawing in automation envelopes with a pencil tool, or doing it by hand with knobs and recording that automation, doing it with LFOs, doing it with envelopes. There's really almost an overwhelming amount of ways to do it. So, you know, it just comes down to strategically using that kind of stuff in a way that makes your music interesting. So that's the future pad sound. And I guess now we can move on to the additive sound. And you might be wondering why I called this patch Jan. It's kind of my nod to Mr. Jan, spelt with a J, Jan Hammer, Jan Hammer. If that name's familiar to anyone, he's a guy that wrote the Miami Vice theme, or he recorded the Miami Vice theme back in the 80s. And he's a well-known keyboard player in his own right, but also kind of been on my mind lately because I saw this Netflix documentary not too long ago called Cocaine Cowboys, and I was wondering, like, man, why is the music so good in this? And then you know, I saw the credit. It's like, oh yeah, Jan Hammer did the soundtrack. So you know, it definitely does have a very 80s Miami Vice kind of vibe to it. So this next sound is going to be approaching synthesis from kind of more of an additive synthesis perspective. And actually, none of these instruments behind me here could really be considered true additive synths. Additive synthesis is something that you know, we see a lot more in the software world, but there's certain instruments that I've just been, dying to try out. One of them being the Kurzweil K150. I think more so because I'm just a huge fan of Kurzweil in general. But this thing has 240 oscillators, sine and noise apparently. So just think about that, 240 oscillators. So even if you count each one of these as an oscillator, like, yeah, I guess if you get into the 64 mode and you consider like each one of those 64 harmonic partials a different oscillator, and then you times that by 4, yeah, I guess like you're getting into that territory of hundreds of oscillators. But even still, just the fact that they did that, back in 1986, I can just tell this thing's probably got some very cool sounds hiding in it. But also, Mr. Jan Hammer there, I don't know why he's not at the bottom of this list. Oh yeah, there he is, Jan Hammer, bam. Yeah, he's one of the people that's been known to use this thing, the K5M. I think he uses the keyboard version, the K5. But this is another additive synth that has 126 harmonic levels generated by sine wave via bar graph type graphic display. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So I can't help but wonder how much this additive section was inspired by some of those early digital instruments from the 80s. Some of that stuff from like Kawai, and definitely it's sort of thinking along the same lines of using a bar graph display to draw in harmonic partials. And so if you've never seen a Hammond organ, like an old school Hammond organ up close, the way they control their sounds is actually a throwback to much older technology, to pipe organ stops. So pipe organists are used to having stops that they pull out to engage different ranks of pipes, and of course the more stops you pull out, the more pipes are engaged, and kind of the louder your organ is. And you can see down here, this is representing, still on electric organs, it's representing these in lengths. So this would have been your 16-foot pipe, and all the way through to your teeny little 1-foot pipes. So, of course, the shorter the pipe is, the higher the frequency it's going to make. So you can kind of visualize this as like a frequency bar graph going from lower frequencies to higher frequencies. So, it's the exact same idea, where you're kind of painting with frequencies. You're using your pencil tool in this case to come up with sort of a custom combination, if you will, of frequencies, exactly like the drawbars on a Hammond. And actually, what's funny is if I put this into 16 partial mode, sort of the lowest resolution mode, that's not far off from like the Hammond organ had a set of 9 drawbars, 9 harmonic partials that you could mix together. And that's why to this day a lot of MIDI controllers still have 9 sliders on them to control virtual drawbars and various organ programs. So if I take this graph and put the first 4, sort of the reverse of how drawbars work, instead of pulling them out, I'm pushing them up, I guess. But so I mean, it's not the greatest organ sound, I know, but if I disable the filter and do something exotic, like put it through the Guitar Rig Leslie simulator. All right, modulation, rotator. Oh, yes, because they aren't allowed to actually call this a Leslie. They don't want to get sued. But, whoops, it's kind of loud, but turn that down. So this is operator going through a kind of a Leslie simulator, a rotating speaker Leslie simulator, which really is kind of 95% of what makes the Hammond organ sound like the Hammond organ. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. It's maybe 65% of it, but so when it's just those first harmonics we're listening to, it's got a very kind of organ vibe to it, and organs are actually one of the things that operator kind of excels at. Of course, once I start adding too many more harmonics up here, you know, really past this point, it sounds less organic and more like a synthesizer. But if I stick to the first, you know, 9 like a Hammond, it's still pretty organy. So, I mean, that's just an aside. The point wasn't to make an organ sound here, but actually, since this is kind of a house track here that we're making, there's you know, particular organ bass sound that's really popular that comes off the Korg M1, that organ 02 patch that everyone's always trying to imitate, and that's actually a very good sound to take an additive approach to. So if we start with a fresh operator, we can make a quick, you know, 5-second Korg M1 organ bass just by putting our operator in parallel mode. So of course this is going to make it so that none of the oscillators are modulating each other FM styles. They're all going to be independently output. And then we're going to take the first one and we'll switch it to the lowest resolution, the 16 harmonic version. So you can kind of adjust to taste whether you like the second harmonic partial. And you can see actually in the waveform display what it's doing to it, how it's kind of creating that extra kind of fold in there. So you can adjust to taste how strong you like that. I don't like it completely cranked up. I like to have it a little bit more tapered than the fundamental, which would be the first one here. And actually you see that in a lot of sounds when you look at them in spectrum analyzers, they do have that natural kind of like tapering off of frequencies. Like the higher they go, the quieter they get, sort of until you get down really low like this. But I'd put the first one like this, the first oscillator, and then for oscillator B, I'm also going to set this to 16. And let's see, I'm at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th slot over. And really, I'm just doing this by ear. I'm listening out for the pitch that's giving me the that perfect fifth up, that little pop. Traditionally, things like Hammond organs had like percussion controls that would add a little bit of a pop at a different but related harmonic to the fundamental, and already it's taking on that kind of organ-based sound a little bit. But of course, what makes the M1 organ bass so satisfying is that pop, that click that the percussion gives it. So we're going to take oscillator B's envelope and going to do something more like that. Oh yeah, now it's really organy sounding. So, right there, that's another good jumping off point, another potential for for a pretty good sound, that's pretty easy to start with. So again, I was kind of inspired by the Cocaine Cowboys soundtrack, and one of Jan Hammer's things, the thing he was kind of maybe most famous for in the Miami Vice days, was making synthesizer sound like an electric guitar. And of course, that was when all the additive stuff was kind of really new technology, and the first time where synthesizers really could kind of start approaching more complex timbres like that. Of course, you listen to that stuff, and it still kind of sounds a little bit synthetic, but of course, this documentary is from series or whatever is from 2006, so it's definitely sort of using throwback sounds now. But let me go to my Jan track here. So it's a very bright, crystally, kind of gongy sound, but yet it's sort of a different characteristic than FM, and also there's a lot of post filtering going on. As you can tell by now, I'm a big fan of using lots of auto filters after the fact on the chains. And there's definitely nothing against putting filters through more filters. But in this case, we've got two auto filters creating sort of a really broad band pass between this one set to high pass and this one to low pass. The low pass one's got a bit more of a resonance bump, and then the delay there, filter delay. So here's with all this effects turned off. Oop, that was a bit loud. So you can see why some band limiting kind of helps it live in its proper frequency range and not be too overwhelming. And of course, this is sort of more of a background sound. It's got lots of delay going on, and then some compression, kind of glue it all together. So really, we just have the low layer and the shimmer layer. So the cool operator trick that I sort of discovered while I was making this video was this thing over here, this repeat. So down here where it says repeat next to feedback, what this does is it adds extra harmonic partials at a certain interval, a certain repeat of these basically. So, if it would be sort of drawing something that gradually tapers off. And it is a subtle effect, but basically what you can think of it as is sort of like a brightness control. So I've got the shimmer layer here, and my repeat's set to 4. If I set it to off, subtle difference. I'll do that again. Here's 4. So, repeat really makes those high crystally harmonics stand out more. So if you're making a very high frequency oriented sound, then the repeat control, when you're in the additive mode and kind of painting with harmonics like this, it's worth exploring. I'll set it back to 4 where it was. The other thing that's worth remembering when we're making additive sounds like this is that the spaces in between the harmonics are really important too. So if we're especially if we're in like the 64 mode like this. If we just fill up this whole thing, I mean, yeah, it's very buzzy. It's got lots of high harmonics, but it's also very nasally too, and it feels very claustrophobic. So you know, it's good to have little gaps in between things. And also, it's good to remember that you can change it up. You can combine some oscillators that have 32 partials and some that have 64 partials and some that have, you know, the full 64. So the repeat made quite a difference on that one. And actually, the best way to kind of hear what the repeat does is just to do it to the stock sine wave. So one thing to keep in mind about the repeat is that normally it's grayed out. This is probably why I always skipped over it before. I kind of didn't even notice it was there. But the reason that repeat is grayed out, it's not available, is because the oscillator is being modulated by another oscillator. So if it's being used in any of the FM modes, it won't work. So because this is oscillator A, it's not going to work in that mode or that mode or that mode. Any of the modes where another oscillator is flowing into it. It should work in this mode because you can see oscillator A is independent of the other ones. So if I click on that, oh, here we go. Okay, so we do have repeat. Weird. It just, maybe it takes a second to realize that it's available, or maybe you have to just click on the harmonic partials options. Okay, so now I'm curious to see if those other modes will work or not, because in theory, as long as A is separate, so I'll go back to this one. Yep, and we have repeat. So, okay. I was right. Operator's just being weird. Anyways, let's go back to the parallel mode there. And here's just a regular sine wave, just the first fundamental harmonic up. Repeat is off. If I turn repeat on to a quarter, so it's interesting. It's adding this very, very high extra harmonic on top, or probably a series of them. And I notice it on the lower notes that I'm playing, but then as soon as I get past like middle C, I don't hear it anymore, probably because they're out of our hearing range now. So that's at a quarter. Let's try half. So hopefully that gives you some idea of what the repeat control does. So notice that as soon as you switch to another wave shape, you don't get the repeat option anymore. So it has to be on sine, and you have to be, you know, in the additive mode. So one of these has to be selected. So it's definitely worth noting when you're creating an additive sound like this. We'll go back to my Yan track here. So for context, here's the bit of this Cocaine Cowboys soundtrack that I had in mind when I was making this sound. So you can definitely hear what I mean about the sort of faux electric guitar thing. And You can hear that that sort of line in there. It's probably a lot of delay, but just reminds me of 80s action movies and stuff like that. And certainly the kind of sound that I would jump to additive synthesis right away to try and achieve, for sure. So that is really kind of all that's going on in the yawn patch. I'll put these back together. You notice I have a chord on the shimmer layer, and it's actually transposed down an octave. I think originally I intended to put an actual chord here, but this could just as easily be the pitch plugin set to -12, in case you're wondering about that. So yeah, that's the yawn track, and that brings us to the last of the synthesis methods, which is FM. So before we do that, let's just quickly review some additive tips. So again, oscillator A, B, and C can be independently set to 16, 32, or 64 harmonics, and you can mix it up so they can all be on different ones. The spacing between harmonics is important, so don't necessarily think you have to fill up your entire frequency spectrum, and definitely play around with relative volume levels. Just piling up a bunch of frequencies at the same volume is really a good way to sort of clutter things up. On fancier additive synths, each one of these harmonics would probably have its own envelope and would really help create all kinds of really complex sounds, but of course be very, very complex to program. Like, can you imagine 200 oscillators, or however many, 240 oscillators and 240 envelopes? It's hard enough to keep track of an instrument rack that's got a few operators and maybe like 16 envelopes going on, let alone 240 of them. So there's always going to be a trade-off, but definitely don't be afraid to experiment with that and ganging a bunch of operators together and having each one do a very sort of hyper-specific thing. And that repeat control that we just talked about in the oscillator section can add higher harmonics that taper off in volume. Just remember the catch there, that repeat is only active when the oscillator is not being FM'd by another oscillator. So, I mean, you can still apply FM to it, presumably through the LFO. If we have our destination set to A. I mean, we've even got a little bit of LFO modulation on it right now, just a very subtle amount. And again, I'm just a big fan of that, having very, very subtle amounts of like vibrato of pitch modulation like that. So yeah, that's definitely not affected. But we can't have it in any of the modes where oscillator A is being FM'd by any of the other oscillators. Or, if we were doing this to D, now presumably D would be the one to do it to, since D is the one that is at the top of the chain in all of these. Like, you can see it's not being modulated by any of the other operators, but it is modulating some of the other ones. So let's try that. Let's put D, and yep, sure enough, repeat is an option. If we click on one of the other algorithms, then yep, we still have repeat. So there you go. If you want this repeat to sort of guaranteed work in additive mode, then apply it to oscillator D, and then that way, even if there's FM going on, that won't affect being able to use repeat. But of course, this being at the top of the chain, all of these have to be on, in order for this to be actually going through to the main output. So, of course, there's always going to be a trade-off there, but it's kind of an interesting effect. I think I kind of messed up my preset here, so I'm going to go back to my user library. There we go. And that, people, is why we make presets, so we can, endlessly tweak our sounds, but still get back to somewhat where we started from. Okay, so now that we have that additive stuff out of the way, FM. So I'm sure most of you are probably somewhat familiar with FM synthesis and sort of its characteristic sounds. Frequency modulation can produce a lot of overtones. So, again, very bright digital sorts of sounds. But things get really interesting when you start messing with the operator tunings and, detuning things in interesting ways. It can be less predictable than subtractive and additive synthesis, especially when you're just sort of blindly messing around with operator combinations and tunings and stuff. But that's sort of part of its charm, and you find some of the strangest and coolest combinations this way. So it's something that's worth pursuing and worth getting frustrated a few times over, because it's going to yield some pretty unique sounds. FM sounds tend to be very thumpy and thuddy a lot of times. Some of these digital envelopes on stuff like the DX7 when it came out, they were just so much more accurate and snappy than the stuff that you had on analog synths that were sort of limited by the components in the circuitry. But the trade-off is if you're programming at a DX7, you might have an envelope that's like 7 minutes long or something, and you're wondering, why can't I hear anything? So it's not necessarily as intuitive either. So there's always going to be a trade-off. So the sound that we're sort of going for here, that we're trying to recreate in operator, is called the lately bass. And originally, the lately bass is off of the humble little Yamaha TX-81Z. This is kind of a favorite of bedroom producers in the late 80s and early 90s. Came out in 1987. I don't have a TX-81Z. It's one of those things that I figured I'd come into one of these days. There certainly seems to be a lot of them out there. Again, most people keep these around for like their 2 or 3 choice sounds, the lately bass being one of them. This really was a popular kind of budget piece of equipment back in the day. But that lately bass is all over everything. And, if you're of a certain age like me and you kind of grew up in the 1990s, then you definitely could not escape the lately bass. So I actually use FM8 for my lately bass needs. The reason being that FM8 will straight up read these what are called sysx files, these .syx things, which are just the configuration files that tell the TX-81Z how to set up the patches. So they're directly compatible. FM8's got all the exact same available settings and waveforms and such. So that's a pretty direct translation. There we go. It's a pretty recognizable sound, and everyone that's my age knows it from this. So anyways, certain sounds age really well and other sounds not so much. Like that weird, like, ruler plucking duck sound. I don't know what's up with that. I guess I kind of blocked that out of my mind. I forgot that was in this track. All I remembered about it was the lately bass, which definitely has aged quite well, and that's still kind of a staple sound in house music. So it's good to figure out how to create, something that's kind of lately bass-esque on different stuff. I mean, of course, not everyone has FM8 or wants to shell out the money to buy FM8. So here's my attempt at recreating the lately bass in operator, which actually ended up being 3 operators stacked on top of each other. So this whole rack is called the operately bass. And well, first let's solo the FM8 version of this bass so you can hear what that sounds like. Okay, so that's the original sound, or I mean, as close as I can get without a TX-81Z. And here's my instrument rack one. Now, are they exactly the same? No, but I think they're reasonably close. Of course, the low layer, I had to transpose one layer down an octave because I felt it just wasn't really cutting the mustard. It wasn't sounding kind of thick enough. And also had to employ some saw D, which the original sound isn't using sawtooth waves directly. It's actually making use of feedback on one of the operators. So I did try that actually, ironically, on my second attempt at making the lately bass with just one operator, but I wasn't really feeling this one. It sounds very thin and weak, even though I tried to incorporate the same sort of oscillator feedback. You can hear how it gives it that sort of bite in the top end. But I mean, it seemed like no matter what I did with this one operator, I could just never get it sounding thick enough. So it was a good attempt, and it's always good to experiment. Of course, it's good to remember that things like oscillator feedback in operator even exist. But I'd consider that a failed attempt. I think the operately bass, I was sort of on the right track before, just stacking a few of these together. So I've got the high layer that takes care of that high sawtoothy kind of snap. There's a second high layer that's a little bit more percussive. And actually I fiddled with the time controls a little bit on these. I sort of took the same patch and copied it over and played around with it. The idea being that I wanted to recreate that nice kind of splat that the original lately bass has. So I figured if the envelope timings were just a little bit different, then it might kind of help achieve that. And then we've got our sort of throaty low layer, which on its own actually isn't even that far off from the lately bass. I mean, maybe even just those two layers together are a little more accurate. So, I mean, it's a work in progress. This could definitely be beefed up with some more post-processing. I've got an auto filter and a compressor and a limiter on there right now. I definitely am still striving to achieve that nice stabby percussiveness of the original. And actually, this together with the FM81, they actually sound really nice together. They're a good complementary pair, I think. So yeah, I mean, they definitely sound more fat when they're both playing together like that. Now, just as a quick aside, before we kind of talk about the last stuff here. Well, first, let's get the operator tips out of the way. So, my advice for really learning any FM synth, but operator included, is just to start simple and make note of what your favorite modulator and carrier combinations are. So, I know it sounds vague, but you sort of have to put your legwork in when you're learning stuff like operator, and just sitting there and getting familiar with, okay, sine wave modulated by sine wave sounds like this. Sine wave modulated by square wave sounds like this. And sort of trying to commit those sounds to memory. Of course, it's going to change when you start playing with tuning ratios and algorithm combinations. It's just never going to be as predictable as subtractive or additive methods are going to be. So it's probably best to just play around and get as well versed in as many of these combinations as you can. And that's kind of part of the same point. Try to change the algorithm combinations and hear what happens. So, I mean, even if you just set these all to more or less the same volume, and change the different combinations. Of course, the one on the right is going to sound just like a sine wave because it's parallel. There's no modulation happening. So, I'm going to leave that experimenting up to you guys. And that's pretty much it for the kind of main bullet points about FM and additive and subtractive sounds. Now, I did want to mention some of the kind of extra stuff in here. Also, I mean, this definitely focuses on operator. We're talking about sort of three different methods to make sounds in operator. But operator is definitely not the be-all and end-all of FM synthesizers. And, I always encourage people to get a nice variety of stuff, whatever it may be. So, it's always good to have, a couple of different choices for FM synths. And, operator's a great one, but there's also a couple of free VSTs out there that are really good. And of course, more importantly, they're free. So rather than going the FM8 route, you can download Dexed. It's called DEXXED. Or there's another one called OXE FM synth. And actually, a lot of people are really big fans of Dexed, and myself included. Dexed is a great synth in its own right. But the Aux FM synth I get a lot of use from too, because it also can open the old sysx files or the originals. So you get a lot of good DX7 sounds. And if you really need that authentic lately bass, there's even, boom, a lately bass right there. Now, of course, the point of making a lately bass in Operator wasn't to exactly clone this sound, but to get something that's kind of in the spirit. So if you're a purist and you absolutely need that exact lately bass, then there it is. But you know, I'm just a fan of cheesy DX7 sounds, like the harmonica and stuff like that. Things that are kind of deliberately used for their obnoxiousness, like the nice electric piano sounds a la Law and Order. I mean, it's super cheeseball, but I mean, that's exactly what I'm into. So yeah, it's called OXE, Aux FM Synth, and it's well worth the download. So there's also a couple other little ancillary sounds in here that are just there to fill out the arrangement a little bit. You got the obligatory hey sample in there, but also we've got these dub techno chords here. These things. And this is one of those like really simple sounds that like I always find myself reaching for Operator for these things. Even though you could make something very similar to this in analog or really almost anything. This is just one Operator with all saw Ds, I'm pretty sure. Yep, all saw Ds. So, without all the processing, I'll take off all this filtering and echo and phaser and stuff. You can still hear the reverb, but it's not a very exciting sound. It's just a very short, spiky kind of envelope. The filter envelope is also kind of short and spiky, and we can see what it sounds like without the Operator filter. I personally like it better with the filter envelope and Operator, but you can see that both auto filters, I'm doing a sort of a similar thing that we were doing to the Jan track, where we've got one auto filter that's high passing and one that's low passing, and they're stuck together to make one wide kind of band pass. But you can see that the LFO on each of these is turned up, so even though you can't see it, the cutoff frequency is being slowly swept back and forth on each one. So between that and the phaser, and adding some sweep into that, it's enough variation that you want the sound that's feeding into this to be pretty simple, just a stabby sawtooth chord, nothing too crazy or textured, because it's this type of sound that we want the effects to kind of carry. the sort of final thing to talk about now that we've covered those three main sounds, operator sounds, is the drums. And my original concept for this whole video was to create a track, entirely of all operators, every element, all the drums, everything. And I very well might still do that at some point. It's a pretty ambitious undertaking. And of course you can make some fairly passable electronic drum sounds using operator, but I just thought for the vibe of this kind of track, it really needed those driving kind of house drums. So I ended up cheating a little bit, and you can see I've just got a couple of 4 on the floor kicks here. There's the regular 909 kick, and then the sort of more subby version of it, which, when you put those two together, they make a really good complementary pair. So, of course, those are just about as plain and generic as you can get, 4 on the floor styles. And then the hi-hat track here. So our hi-hats, you'll notice there's a Max for Live MIDI effect here called Instant House, and this is part of the Max for Live Essentials. So if you don't have the Max for Live Essentials downloaded, chances are some stuff in this live pack just probably wasn't working, the drums and the reverb and such. So you kind of need those to get everything happening on this. But they're just generally good things to have. If you don't already have Max for Live Essentials downloaded, it definitely behooves you to get it. It's very useful for a number of reasons. And the Instant House is just one of many things that it includes. The LFO and envelope MIDIs are another thing that Max for Live Essentials comes with, as well as the convolution reverb. So lots of really useful stuff there. So we've got Instant House here, which is just kind of generating some house drum patterns. Although this one's only doing hi-hats, I have it driving a sampler here. And if I look at the zone editor, you can see the closed and the open hi-hats there respectively. And if I just solo this here. So, there's a couple of ways you can do this. We could have a drum rack here and then just have a simpler, one with a closed hat and one with the open hat. Or, do it with a instrument rack even. But I did it with sampler, just to have more sort of control over the envelope and stuff like that. I can mess with the volume envelope. If I change the pattern, you can see there's no open hat happening right now. There we go. So you can do stuff like mess around with the envelope, the time control. It's a good one to kind of get some good variation in the length of your sounds. So this is just going to affect the hi-hats, of course, nothing else. So this track that's called Minimal Drums, this one has another Instant House, although this one is in the breaks mode and not the house mode. And this one is driving a drum rack, but it's all made up of various, operator percussion sounds, some pretty sharp, snappy, short envelopes. Some have, some white noise. That hattish one is sort of vaguely reminiscent of a hi-hat. It's actually not the worst hi-hat I've ever heard. A couple of sort of drummy sounding things. This is just operator going through a Corpus resonator. It's kind of neat. It sounds like a tabla or something like that. And so when you combine those elements together, and actually if you just hit the pattern randomization, it'll randomize all this stuff at once. So I decided to do the drums this way rather than programming too much, just so you guys could have more fun with it and just randomizing and seeing what cool patterns you can come up with. The great thing is if you find something that is really awesome and you want to have that pattern committed, like this sort of thing is really great for coming up with ideas. But when it comes time to actually, record and stitch things together, I'd make a new MIDI track and actually just, take the MIDI straight from this minimal drums track here. Something's not right here. Not seeing any midis. So what did we do wrong here? So we want 5 minimal drums. I want post effects. There we go. So I mean that's kind of a critical part of the routing here. When you go pre-effects up here, it considers instant house an effect. So you're taking the MIDI before it's even being generated by instant house. So that would certainly make a lot of sense. So that's why we have to have this in post effects mode. So now let's see if this works. Cool. So now I've got that MIDI. That's the MIDI that Instant House just kind of spat out for me. And then I should be able to just dump this on the minimal drums track. And then just, disable the Instant House so it's only getting the MIDI from here. And there we go. Cut off the first drum or whatever, but and actually, what's cool about doing it this way is you can take these patterns that are generated and then add to them. Take your pencil tool and draw in little fills and stuff. Wow, that was actually cooler than I expected. I just sort of accidentally landed on that one reverse drum, and I kind of like that. have it. That's the video. So of course I'm pre-recording this, but I'm going to be at the ready when this is being broadcast, and I'm here to answer your questions and talk about any stuff on the live chat, generate some discussion, and I'm really pleased that you came and checked out my presentation, and I hope you can make some good use of the live pack and the sounds, and I hope they inspire you to create some more sounds of your own. Take care and have a wonderful day.